It's happening. Adults across the country can buy cannabis. People have a lot of questions, so I invited some friends over to talk about it. Joining me today is Abi Roach from Hotbox Lounge.
And for an emerging industry, it doesn't actually make sense.
Derek Ogden, ex-RCMP drug enforcement.
I think they're going way overboard on that. I understand the rationale.
And Hugo Alves from Auxly.
It is, in my view, the worst part of the Cannabis Act.
I'm Chuck Rafici, and we're talking the biz. With legalization, the government's rolling out very strict rules for packaging. Do we think that's fair?
I think it's overkill. We have Snapple making alcoholic beverages and advertising on the sides of bus stations. Even cigarette companies can differentiate themselves between one brand of cigarettes to another. And you're forcing cannabis, which is far less harmful than tobacco, sugar, and alcohol, to be put in white, black, essentially envelopes and packets, right? It doesn't really make sense, and it's not really fair.
I think they're going way overboard on that. I understand the rationale for ensuring that the advertising is not targeted to youth. I get that. I think that's smart. It's a wise move on their part. But on the branding, I think you need to let these companies, these are new companies, let them build their brands. These brands hopefully are not going to just stay in Canada. These brands are going to go international, and it's very important that they get a foothold here in Canada, get known, and then go international. There's a lot tied to that.
Well, it was interesting how the task force report on legalization actually said that they felt that the harms from cannabis were probably at least equal or less than alcohol. Yet they felt that the alcohol advertising rules were just not right. So their sense was that we should make it more like tobacco, even though we see how alcohol is advertised, and it does seem to be quite kind of odd to have a very loose alcohol rules versus cannabis. I mean, Hugo, is cannabis exactly like tobacco when it comes to the advertising guidelines?
No, I think we have to understand that in Canada, there is a continuum in terms of the legal prohibitions or restrictions around branding and advertising. On the one hand, you have alcohol, which is very permissive. In the middle, you would have narcotics, what cannabis is currently subject to, which is restrictive. And then all the way over here, because it's such a public health, kind of problem, you have tobacco, which is prohibitive. It's not restrictive, it's prohibitive.
Can you mean just, what do you mean by prohibitive versus
restrictive? I mean you can't advertise effectively. So we've done the analysis. We've taken the Tobacco Act and we've taken the Cannabis Act, and we've compared the provisions around marketing and advertising and promotion. They are almost a direct copy. There are a few instances where I think the Cannabis Act gives you one or two additional exemptions that the Tobacco Act doesn't have.
So it's a little easier to advertise slightly.
Well, it's not that it's easier, because it's not easy at all.
No.
It's almost impossible. But there is in my view, no rational tie to making the branding and promotion or marketing of cannabis akin to tobacco. Like, that is overkill, and I think it creates a competitive advantage for people who have been able to be in the regulated industry and not had to deal with those restrictions relative to a new micro grower or someone who transitions in, or a new company. They can't build brand traction as fast.
And to that point, a company like my own that's been around for almost 2 decades, there's nothing that has stopped us from advertising or marketing in a certain way. So right now, I actually have the upper hand in this situation because my branding is recognizable. And that's kind of an interesting turn of events.
It is absolutely. But, so apart from creating that advantage, it also, from a market perspective, it puts you at a disadvantage for competing with the unregulated industry. Yep. Because look, if advertising didn't work, if human desires and perceptions weren't impacted by branding and marketing, like, there would be no advertising industry, and this would be a moot point. We'd be talking about something else.
Well, I mean, so on that point, right, Hugo, it's your view, right, if I understand, is that the these heavily advertising restrictions are going to help the black market. They're going to make the black market products, the unregulated market, more attractive, right?
If you're engaged in black market activity, so if you're engaged in criminal activity, like, you're not going to care if you're offside the advertising restrictions, because you're offside the underlying activity, which is criminal. So you're going to go, hey, I'm already selling illegally, so what do I care if I advertise or not? I'm willing to take that risk.
The political hot potato of cannabis is the smoke. So
Exactly.
it's the smoke. So to politicians and to people who aren't consumers, first thing that you imagine when someone is consuming cannabis is maybe the first thought is a joint, the second thought is smoke, and the third thought is cancer. You're going to give everybody cancer, right? So now we're seeing all these issues around smoke. I think that the conversation needs to be moved away from tobacco in general, and again goes back to education, educating politicians, and educating the public.
I think some of the branding and advertising restrictions, though, it just doesn't, it's not just kind of public health from the perspective of we're going to encourage more people to smoke. I think it's also tied very heavily to that core concern about keeping it out of the hands of young children and people who are impressionable.
And something to be said about youth as well. Are you going to shut down YouTube and Instagram, and are you going to, and Snapchat, are you going to shut it down? No. So you're not going to stop young people from seeing other people consuming cannabis. You're not going to, it's not going to stop. The safer thing would be to allow for branding that encourages adult consumption. So if you can create packaging that is not so kiddie, maybe less cartoony, less bubbly, right? So maybe taking the packaging the other way is what we should be encouraging, as opposed to just like bland, here's a black paper thing that we're like, it's so shameful that you're, consuming cannabis.
Well, exactly. And on the tobacco side, I think the intent is really to lower usage year after year after year. That's the goal, and that goal makes sense. It definitely makes sense from a public health standpoint. But I don't think that wasn't. It's my understanding of the whole idea behind the new legislation is not to discourage or encourage use. It's to allow people to use responsibly and allow them to use a product that's been tested and regulated. So I don't understand why they would adopt a set of regulations around branding that would really move people toward that. This is really bad. If you must use it, go ahead, but and kind of discourage.
It's shaming.
It's
Shaming
packaging.
packaging.
It just promulgates stigma.
Yeah.
It just goes like, hey, you're doing something bad and dirty, and that's why you have this skull and crossbones. You're poisoning yourself.
How's it going to get fixed? Is it going to just be Canadians en masse who just kind of realize that this is just kind of crazy? I mean, you have a product tobacco that kills people, alcohol that has a lot of health issues, and I think most people view cannabis as, well, our own task force views cannabis as less harmful generally than alcohol, yet it is in line with tobacco for advertising. I mean, how do we fix this problem?
Yeah,
how will it get fixed?
I mean, really, that's what's so disappointing, because I think everyone kind of feels that once it's entrenched, right? It's really tough to go backwards. I think what they're doing around the product identification, I really like that. I love the fact that the percentages are on there. It gives you that information. I think that's all really key stuff. I'm even okay on a warning side, like whether it's to raise awareness on impaired driving or some of the other ones that seem somewhat rational. But boy, on this branding one, I think that once it dies in the water, it's going to be really difficult to get it out.
I personally the reason that we got here is because people moved that needle inch by inch by inch by inch, right? It's like my theory about my business has always been, they give me an inch, I take an inch and a half. I never jump too far over. And I think the industry now, the new industry that's coming up, needs to learn a little bit from the past about how to be creative with the law, right? So I think once you just push it and nudge it a little bit here and there and and then eventually it will get to where you want it to be. But I think there's a lot more power in the new industry to be able to move and nudge that line further a lot faster.
And it's a great point, because while you were saying that, I was thinking to myself, well, the tobacco industry hasn't been able to do it, and they sure hell have been trying, and they got way more money than the cannabis industry, and they throw a lot of money at this issue. But the distinction there is, though, like, tobacco doesn't have a history of activism and doesn't have this sort of, it doesn't have public health
No.
and the improvement of people's lives on their side. So hopefully, you're right. Hopefully, the advocates and the people who take the inch and a half will have more success in moving those boundaries than the tobacco industry.
Great conversation, really stirred the pot on this topic. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Chad.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, Jeff.